The will was a blade, and the room was the wound it left behind. Elara felt the cold seep through the thin fabric of her dress, a chill that had nothing to do with the fierce air conditioning of the lawyer's office and everything to do with the three figures seated across the polished mahogany table. Her stepmother, Isabelle, and her two stepsisters, Brianna and Chloe, were vultures in couture, their faces masks of feigned solemnity that couldn't quite hide the triumphant glint in their eyes. They had already won. The air was thick with the scent of their expensive perfume and the silent, screaming finality of it all. Mr. Gable, the family solicitor, a man whose face seemed carved from old parchment, cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the hushed room. He read the last codicil, the words clinical and precise, stripping away the final vestiges of Elara's hope. To Isabelle, the sprawling suburban house. To Brianna, the stock portfolio, a formidable collection of blue-chip certainties. To Chloe, the art collection and the jewelry, a small fortune in aesthetics and precious metals. And then now he came to her. To Elara, his voice softened with something that might have been pity. To my great-granddaughter, Elara, I leave the one thing that carried me to this new world and built the foundation of our family. I leave her my Singer sewing machine. The silence that followed was heavier than any sound. Then a snort from Brianna, quickly stifled behind a perfectly manicured hand. Chloe exchanged a smirk with her mother. The sewing machine, the old, cracked, useless thing that had sat in the attic for decades, a relic of a past they were all too eager to forget. It was more than an afterthought. It was an insult. A punchline to a joke she had been the butt of her entire life. Mr. Gable looked at her over his spectacles. You can, of course, refuse the bequest, in which case it will be disposed of. Isabelle leaned forward, her voice a syrupy weapon. Oh, let her have it, dear. It's fitting. A little trinket for the little seamstress. Maybe she can patch up that dreary life of hers. The laughter was quiet, but it filled the room, echoing in Elara's ears. Her face burned with shame, but beneath it, a different fire started to smolder. It was a flicker of defiance, small and stubborn. She looked at their smug, satisfied faces, at the easy wealth they had just acquired, wealth her great-grandmother, Serafina, had painstakingly built from nothing. And they were laughing at the very tool that had created it all. She lifted her chin, her voice quiet but clear, cutting through their amusement. I'll take it. This was the moment everything changed. The moment a forgotten woman's last wish began to unravel a secret that would shatter their world and remake hers. She had no idea that inside the rusted bobbin case of that machine lay not just a secret, but a legacy waiting to be claimed. A fortune so vast it would rewrite history, and a responsibility that would test the very essence of her soul. This wasn't just an inheritance, it was a reckoning. If you're just joining us, make sure to hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Now let's get back to the story. The drive home was a blur of gray cityscapes and the suffocating feeling of being utterly and completely alone. The sewing machine, heavy and awkward, sat in her passenger seat, a silent, hulking passenger from another time. Its wooden case was scarred with the marks of a long and arduous life, the varnish worn away in patches, revealing the pale, tired grain beneath. One of the hinges on the cover was broken, held together with a piece of rusted wire. It smelled of dust, old oil, and something else. Something that reminded her of the one time she had met Serafina, a brief, fleeting memory from early childhood. She remembered a lap that smelled of lavender and thread, and hands, wrinkled and wise, that had shown her how to guide a piece of fabric under the needle's rhythmic dance. That memory was the only thing of value she thought she possessed. Her apartment was small, a third-floor walk-up with tired walls and a window that looked out onto a symphony of brick and fire escapes. She wrestled the machine inside, its weight a physical manifestation of her grief and her inheritance. She placed it on the small kitchen table, the only clear surface in the cramped space. It dominated the room, an anachronism in her world of cheap particle board furniture and disposable goods. For a long time, she just stood there, looking at it. The laughter of her stepsisters still echoed in her mind, a cruel counterpoint to the machine's stoic silence. They saw a piece of junk, a confirmation of her status as the family charity case, the quiet, mousy girl who was always an afterthought. But as Elara ran her hand over the cracked wooden cover, she felt something else, a connection, a thread, however thin, to the formidable woman she barely knew, a woman who had crossed an ocean with nothing but this machine and the skill in her hands. This was Serafina's anchor. Now it was hers. The evening light faded, casting long shadows across the room. She didn't turn on the lights. She simply sat with the machine in the gathering dark. The city's hum, a distant lullaby. There was no fortune, no grand gesture of love. There was only this heavy, broken, beautiful thing. And for the first time since the reading of the will, she didn't feel poor. She felt anchored. She decided to clean it, to honor it in the only way she knew how. It was a way of connecting with Serafina, a quiet communion with the ghost in the machine. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the grimy window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Elara had laid out old towels on the floor, creating a makeshift workspace. She approached the task with a reverence she hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just cleaning, it was an act of preservation, a ritual. She started with the wooden case, using a soft, damp cloth to wipe away decades of attic grime. As the dirt came away, the true character of the wood began to emerge. A deep, rich cherry color, scarred but not broken. She imagined Serafina's hands polishing this same surface, her brow furrowed in concentration. The thought was a comfort, a small warmth in the cold reality of her life. She lifted the heavy machine from its base and set it on the towels. The iconic gold singer lettering was faded but still elegant against the black enamel body. The filigree was intricate, a testament to a time when even functional objects were made with artistry. She found a small tin of sewing machine oil in her own modest sewing kit, a cheap plastic thing she used for mending clothes, and began to work on the moving parts. A drop of oil on the handwheel, another on the needle bar. She worked slowly, methodically, losing herself in the rhythmic, meditative process. It was when she turned her attention to the bobbin compartment that she felt it. The slide plate that covered the area was stiff. It resisted her touch, refusing to glide back as it should. She pushed a little harder, a faint scraping sound echoing in the quiet apartment. It finally gave way, revealing the shuttle and bobbin case within. Everything looked normal at first glance, coated in a thin layer of old gummy oil and lint. She reached in to remove the bobbin case, a small, silver-colored metal piece shaped like a bullet. It was surprisingly heavy. As she lifted it out, she noticed something odd. The bottom of the compartment wasn't flat. There was a false floor, a thin metal plate that sat just a fraction of an inch higher than the surrounding cast iron. Her heart gave a little flutter. This was strange. It wasn't part of the machine's design. She knew enough about old singers to know that. It was an addition. Her fingers, nimble from years of small repairs and detailed work, probed the edges of the plate. She found a tiny indentation, almost invisible to the naked eye. Using the tip of a small screwdriver from her eyeglass repair kit, she gently pried at it. The plate resisted, then, with a soft click, it lifted. Her breath caught in her throat. Beneath it lay not a secret stash of cash or a hidden jewel, but something far more intriguing. It was a small, hollow cylinder made of brass, no bigger than her thumb. It was heavy, dense, and cool to the touch. The surface was smooth, with no discernible opening or seam. But etched into its surface, in a delicate, spidery script, was a series of numbers in a single cryptic phrase. Dove la navetta incontra il filo. Italian. She didn't speak it, but she recognized the cadence of the language from the opera her father used to play. Below the phrase was a long string of numbers, separated by dashes. It wasn't a bank account number, not in any format she recognized. It was too long, too complex. She held the brass cylinder in the palm of her hand. It felt ancient, imbued with a weight that was more than just physical. This was no random trinket. This was a secret, a deliberate, carefully hidden message from her great-grandmother. The laughter of her stepsisters seemed a distant, foolish sound now. They had laughed at a piece of junk while she was holding a mystery. The phrase, she quickly translated it online, where the shuttle meets the thread. It sounded like a line from a poem, a piece of sewing wisdom. But Serafina had not gone to this much trouble to hide a sewing tip. It was a code. a key. And as Elara sat on the floor of her tiny apartment, the sun warming her back, she felt a profound shift within her. The grief and loneliness were still there, but now they were joined by a new electrifying emotion. Purpose. The sewing machine wasn't an insult. It was an invitation, a challenge. And Elara, for the first time in her life, felt ready to accept it. The brass cylinder became the focal point of her existence. She carried it with her everywhere. The cool, heavy weight in her pocket, a constant reminder of the mystery that now defined her days. The numbers remained an enigma, a meaningless string of digits that yielded nothing on any search engine. It was the phrase that consumed her, where the shuttle meets the thread. She repeated it to herself until the words lost their meaning and became a mantra. It had to be a metaphor. Serafina was a practical woman. Every story she'd ever heard about her emphasized her resourcefulness, her lack of sentimentality when it came to survival. A poetic clue was not her style, unless the poetry itself was a map. Elara's first instinct was to dive into the world of sewing, thinking the clue was literal. She spent hours in the library, poring over antique sewing machine manuals and historical textile journals. She learned about lock stitches and chain stitches, about the intricate dance between the upper thread and the bobbin thread, the precise moment of intersection where a stitch is formed. But it led nowhere to phone. The phrase was too common, too fundamental to the craft to be a unique identifier. Defeated, she shifted her focus from the craft to the craftswoman. Who was Serafina Volya? The family narrative, as curated by Isabelle, was simple and dismissive. A poor, uneducated immigrant who got lucky. But that never felt right. A woman who could build a small textile empire from a single sewing machine was not merely lucky, she was brilliant. Elara started digging deeper, away from family lore and into public records. She spent a week at the city archives, her eyes sore from scrolling through microfilmed immigration records. And there she found it. Serafina Volya, arriving at the port 30 years before Elara was born. Her country of origin was listed as a small, mountainous region that had been swallowed by bigger, more aggressive neighbors and no longer existed on modern maps. Her profession, artigiana tessile, textile artisan. But it was a small, handwritten note in the margin of the manifest, made by an immigration officer, that made Elara's breath catch. Traveling alone, carries only a sewing case and a weaver's ledger. A weaver's ledger, not a seamstress's, weaving, the shuttle, the thread. The pieces began to click into place, forming a picture far grander than she had imagined. The phrase wasn't about sewing a seam, it was about weaving a fabric, about the interlocking of warp and weft. It was about creation, about structure, and it was about finance. A final desperate search, combining the new terms, yielded a hit. It was a deeply buried academic paper on informal economic systems used by displaced populations in the early 20th century. The paper mentioned a clandestine, trust-based banking network founded by refugees for refugees. It had no physical branches, no formal charters. It operated on reputation and intricate codes. Its members were weavers, tailors, and textile merchants, and they used the language of their trade to conduct their business. The institution's informal name, whispered in a dozen languages in the cramped tenements of the New World, was the Weavers' Trust. The paper mentioned that the trust was eventually absorbed, its assets folded into a larger, more conventional bank during a wave of financial consolidation in the 1970s. That bank was Consolidated Mercantile, which, after a series of mergers and acquisitions, was now known as Viridian Global Finance, one of the largest and most powerful financial institutions in the world. Its headquarters was a monolithic tower of black glass and steel that scraped the sky in the heart of the financial district. The numbers on the brass cylinder were not a code. They were an account number, an old, dormant, and a very real account number. Standing on the crowded sidewalk, staring up at the impassive glass facade of the Viridian Tower, Elara felt a tremor of fear and awe. The sewing machine was not a tool for mending clothes. It was the key to a vault. And her great-grandmother was not just a seamstress. She was a banker for the forgotten. The weight in her pocket now felt impossibly heavy, a burden of history she was only beginning to understand. She clutched the cylinder, the metal cold against her skin, and took the first step toward the revolving doors. The lobby of Iridian Global Finance was a cathedral built to the god of money. The ceilings were impossibly high. The floors were a polished expanse of black marble that reflected the cold, recessed lighting, and the air itself seemed to hum with a low, powerful frequency of immense wealth. People in impeccably tailored suits moved with a silent, predatory grace, their voices hushed, their expressions severe. It was a world away from her third-floor walk-up, and Elara felt her own insignificance like a physical cloak. She approached the main reception desk, a monolithic slab of granite manned by a woman whose smile was as polished and impenetrable as the stone she sat behind. "Can I help you?" the woman asked, her tone suggesting she very much doubted it. Elara's voice was a small, unsteady thing in the cavernous space. I have an inquiry about an old account from a bank called the Weaver's Trust." The woman's smile didn't falter, but a flicker of something, annoyance perhaps, passed through her eyes. "I'm not familiar with that name. Viridian has no affiliation with any Weaver's Trust. It was absorbed by Consolidated Mercantile in the 70s. Elara pressed, her voice gaining a sliver of confidence as she recited the facts she'd memorized. "My great-grandmother held an account there." The receptionist typed something into her computer, her expression bored. "That would be a legacy account. All such inquiries are handled by the archives department. You'll need to make an appointment and provide extensive documentation." She slid a brochure across the counter. "The requirements are listed here." Elara looked at the list. It was a bureaucratic nightmare. Original birth certificates, death certificates, immigration papers, proof of lineage notarized by a dozen different agencies, documents she couldn't possibly possess for a woman who came from a country that no longer existed. It was a wall designed to be unclimbable. "I have the account number," Elara said, a hint of desperation in her voice. She pulled the brass cylinder from her pocket. The receptionist glanced at it, her lip curling in a faint sneer, as if Elara had presented a child's toy. "Ma'am, we deal in digital records and legal documents, not curios. Please follow the procedure." She was dismissed. Elara retreated from the desk, the eyes of the lobby's inhabitants seemingly tracking her shabby coat and worn-out shoes. She was an anomaly here, a speck of dust in a pristine machine. As she was about to leave, a young man in a slightly less expensive suit intercepted her. He was a junior client associate, his name tag reading Kevin. "I overheard," he said, his voice low. "Legacy accounts are a nightmare. Honestly, even if you had the paperwork, those accounts are usually empty. Old fees ate them up decades ago. You are wasting your time." His tone was meant to be helpful, a piece of friendly, insider advice, but to Elara, it felt like another door slamming in her face. Defeated, she left the tower, the city's noise a jarring assault after the tomb-like silence of the lobby. She walked for hours, the brochure clutched in her hand. The institution was not just unhelpful, it was hostile, designed to protect its assets from inconvenient claims from the past. Just as she was about to give up, to consign the brass cylinder and its mystery to a box in her closet, her phone rang. It was Chloe. Her stepsister's voice was honey-sweet, a tone she only used when she wanted something. "Elara, darling, how are you? We were all just thinking about you. Mother was saying how she hopes you're doing all right with, well, you know." The false sympathy was nauseating. "I'm fine, Chloe," Elara said, her voice flat. "Good, good. Listen, the reason I'm calling, a friend of mine who works downtown mentioned something funny. She said she saw someone who looked a lot like you coming out of the Viridian Tower. That's a pretty fancy place for you, isn't it? Did you find some old stock certificates in that dusty sewing box of yours?" The question was casual, but the underlying greed was a physical force. They knew, or they suspected. A leak, a whisper, a piece of gossip had reached them, and their avarice had been ignited. "I was just running an errand," Elara lied, her heart pounding. "Oh, of course," Chloe said, the sweetness curdling into suspicion. "Well, just remember, darling, we're family. If great-grandmother Serafina left anything of real value behind, we all deserve to share in it. It's only fair." The call ended, but the threat lingered in the air. The battle was no longer just against a faceless institution. The vultures were circling, and they had smelled blood. She was alone, outmatched, and now she was being hunted. The weight of the cylinder in her pocket felt less like a key and more like a target. The walls were closing in. Every path forward seemed to be a dead end, blocked by institutional indifference or familial greed. Elara spent days in a state of anxious paralysis, the brass cylinder sitting on her table, a constant, silent accusation. Giving up felt like a betrayal of Serafina, but continuing felt like a fool's errand. The memory of the immigration officer's note, a weaver's ledger, kept nagging at her. If Serafina had a ledger, where would she have kept it? It wouldn't have been with her. It would have been with someone she trusted, someone who understood the world she was entering. A lawyer, an advocate. In a box of Serafina's things that had been grudgingly given to her years ago, a box her stepmother had deemed sentimental junk, she found a small, leather-bound address book. Most of the entries were faded, the businesses long since closed. But one name was written with a fountain pen, the ink still a deep, defiant blue. Alistair Finch, Esquire, attorney at law. There was an address, old and in a part of the city that had resisted gentrification. A quick search online revealed that the law firm was still there, though Alistair Finch himself was listed as of counsel, a term she learned meant semi-retired. With nothing left to lose, she made the journey. The office was on the second floor of a brick building above a dusty bookstore. The moment she opened the door, she stepped into another era. The air smelled of old paper, leather, and pipe tobacco. The room was wall-to-wall with books, not the decorative, color-coordinated spines of a modern office, but a chaotic, towering forest of legal texts and histories stacked on shelves on the floor, on every available surface. Behind a massive oak desk sat a man who seemed as much a part of the room as the books themselves. Alistair Finch was old, with a cascade of white hair and eyes that were a pale, piercing blue. They held a spark of sharp intelligence that belied his age. He looked at her over a pair of half-moon glasses. "Yes?" he asked, his voice a gravelly rumble. Elara, intimidated, began to stammer, explaining who she was, who her great-grandmother was. At the mention of the name Serafina Volya, Alistair Finch went still. He took off his glasses, polishing them slowly with a handkerchief. "Serafina," he said, the name a soft echo. "I haven't heard that name in 30 years. She was one of my father's first clients, and one of mine." He gestured for Elara to sit. "She was a remarkable woman." "Your family, I imagine, thinks she was just a seamstress." Elara nodded, feeling a surge of validation. "They do." "They're fools," Alistair stated, not unkindly. Serafina was a force of nature. She was the anchor for her entire community. She had a mind for numbers and strategy that would put any Waldo Street shark to shame. She didn't just build a business, she built a sanctuary. Elara felt tears welling in her eyes. For the first time, someone was describing the woman she had always imagined, the woman she felt connected to through the old machine. She took out the brass cylinder and placed it on the desk between them. Alistair picked it up, his old fingers turning it over and over. He read the inscription. A slow smile spread across his face. "Where the shuttle meets the thread," he murmured. "Her password." "Of course." He looked at Elara, his eyes sharp. "She chose you. She left you the machine, didn't she?" Elara nodded. "Her last will was a test," Alistair explained. "A test of character. She knew that anyone greedy enough to want the stocks, the house, the jewels, would be unworthy of her true legacy. She knew that only someone who valued the journey, the tool that started it all, could be trusted with its final destination. This," he said, tapping the cylinder, "is the key to the weaver's trust. My father helped her establish it. It wasn't just a bank account, my dear. It was a lifeline. It held the collective wealth of a community that was wiped off the map. People entrusted their life savings, their family heirlooms, everything to Serafina before they disappeared. She was the custodian. The scope of it, the sheer weight of the responsibility, settled on Elara. This wasn't her money. It was a sacred duty. "The bank won't listen to me," she said, her voice small. "They want papers I don't have." Alistair's smile became a grim, determined line. "They are about to listen to me," he said, his voice resonating with the forgotten power of old-school jurisprudence. "We don't need their papers. We have something better. We have Serafina's ledger. He stood up and walked to a large, dusty safe in the corner of the room, spinning the combination dial with practiced ease. She left it with my father for safekeeping, with instructions that it was only to be opened by her designated heir, the one who presented the key. He pulled out a thick, leather-bound volume and placed it on the desk. They want proof of lineage? This ledger contains the bloodlines of half a lost nation. Let them argue with that. For the first time, Elara felt she was no longer alone. She had a mentor, a guide, and a weapon. The fight was just beginning, but now she had a chance to win. The battle with Viridian global finance became a slow, grinding war of attrition. Alistair Finch, roused from his semi-retirement, was a lion awakened. He moved with a deliberate, relentless pace that the bank's young, aggressive lawyers clearly underestimated. He dispatched letters written in dense, impenetrable legalese, citing obscure historical banking charters and international laws regarding the assets of stateless persons. He filed motions that sent junior associates scrambling into dusty archives, searching for precedents from a century ago. He was an artist of bureaucracy, and he was painting his masterpiece. Elara's role was to assist, to learn. She spent her days in his book-filled office, organizing the names in Serafina's ledger, cross-referencing them with the old immigration manifests she had found, building a mosaic of a lost community. The ledger was more than a list of names and numbers. It was a collection of stories. Each entry had a small, handwritten note from Serafina. The Abramov family, watchmakers. Their son dreams of being a doctor. The Ben Yosef jewels, hidden in the lining of a coat, for their daughter's dowry. Reading it, Elara felt the weight of each life, each shattered dream. This was not an abstract fortune. It was the sum of 1,000 hopes. After 2 months of stonewalling, the bank finally conceded. The legal pressure from Alistair, combined with the undeniable evidence of the ledger, had become too much to ignore. They agreed to unseal the account. The meeting took place not in the bank's gleaming tower, but in Alistair's office. A grim-faced vice president from the bank, flanked by 2 lawyers, arrived with a secured laptop. The atmosphere was thick with tension. The vice president, a woman named Ms. Devereaux, logged into the system with a series of complex passwords. She navigated to the archived legacy accounts. She typed in the long string of numbers from the brass cylinder. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a single line of text appeared on the screen. Account holder, S. Volya, custodian. Account balance, amount, $291,452,817.34. The number just hung there in the air, silent, monstrous, incomprehensible. Elara stared at it, but her mind refused to process it. It was like looking at an astronomical figure, a distance to a star. It had no relation to her life, to her tiny apartment, to the $20 bill in her wallet. It was just data. She felt a wave of dizziness. She looked at Alistair. The old lawyer showed no emotion, but she could see a faint tremor in his hands. Even he was stunned by the scale of it. So, Devereaux cleared her throat, her professional composure strained. The account has been accruing interest, untouched, for over 70 years, she said, her voice tight. As per the court order, the funds are to be transferred to a new account under your client's control. She looked at Elara, her eyes a mixture of disbelief and envy. Congratulations, Ms. Vance. You are a very wealthy woman. But the words felt wrong. Elara didn't feel wealthy. She felt terrified. The number on the screen wasn't a prize. It was a judgment. It was the weight of 1,000 lost souls, and it had just been placed squarely on her shoulders. As the bankers were packing up their equipment, their faces a mixture of professional courtesy and barely concealed resentment. Miss Devereaux paused at the door. There is one more thing, she said, her voice dropping. As we were unsealing the account, our system flagged an automated alert. An inquiry was lodged against this account number 6 weeks ago. Elara's blood ran cold. 6 weeks ago. That was right after her first disastrous visit to the bank. Who made the inquiry? Alistair asked, his voice sharp. We can't be certain, Ms. Devereaux said, a hint of unease in her tone. It came through a high-level diplomatic channel, routed through a private asset recovery firm based in Geneva. The inquiry was on behalf of the current government of the Eastern European Federation. the state that now controls the territory where your great-grandmother was from. She left, the door clicking shut behind her, leaving a chilling silence in her wake. The unseen forces Alistair had warned her about were no longer unseen. They had been alerted. The moment the money became real, it had appeared on a radar screen halfway across the world. And now a government, one known for its corruption and authoritarianism, believed that this vast fortune belonged to them. The victory felt hollow, fleeting. The true fight, the one for the soul of the money, had just begun. The news, when it came, arrived not as a whisper but as a thunderclap. A formal notice of claim was delivered to Alistair's office by a courier who looked more like a bodyguard than a delivery man. The document was thick, bound in a leather folder, and embossed with the seal of a Swiss law firm Elara had never heard of, Calla and Stern. They represented a Geneva-based company called Sovereign Reclamation Group, which in turn was acting on behalf of the Eastern European Federation. The claim was audacious and brutal in its simplicity. They asserted that the funds held in the Weavers' Trust were not the private assets of displaced citizens, but were in effect stolen state assets, spirited away by dissidents and enemies of the state during a period of political turmoil. They were demanding the immediate repatriation of the entire $291 million. It was a lie, a grotesque twisting of history, but it was a lie backed by the power of a nation-state and the legal machinations of a ruthless international firm. Almost simultaneously, the second front of the war opened. A second courier, this one from a local high-priced litigation firm, delivered another notice. Her stepmother and stepsisters were suing her. The lawsuit was a masterpiece of venom and fabrication. It claimed Elara had known about the hidden assets all along, that she had used undue influence on her great-grandmother and had fraudulently concealed the true value of the sewing machine to cheat them out of their rightful inheritance. They demanded the will be nullified and the entire fortune be divided equally among the four of them. Elara was besieged. Her tiny apartment felt like a prison. The phone rang constantly with calls from numbers she didn't recognize. Men in dark suits were seen parked across the street. She was being watched, intimidated. Calla and Stern wanted her to break. Her family wanted her to pay. The pressure was immense, a physical weight that made it hard to breathe. One evening, she received a call from a restricted number. A man with a smooth, accented voice introduced himself as Mr. Thorne, a partner at Sovereign Reclamation Group. He didn't threaten. He soothed. "Ms. Vance," he began, his voice like velvet laced with arsenic, "we understand this must be very overwhelming for you. You are an ordinary person caught in the currents of history. We are prepared to be generous. Settle with us, acknowledge our government's rightful claim, and we will ensure that you are compensated for your troubles. A finder's fee, shall we say, $10 million, tax-free, a new life, with no more complications." The temptation was a physical thing, a seductive whisper in the dark. $10 million. She could disappear. She could be safe. She could have a life free from fear and responsibility. All she had to do was betray the trust of 1,000 ghosts. All she had to do was sell her soul. She looked over at the sewing machine, which now sat in the corner of her living room like a silent sentinel. She thought of the names in the ledger, of the watchmaker's son who dreamed of being a doctor. She thought of Serafina crossing an ocean with nothing but that machine and a promise she intended to keep. She took a deep breath. "The money isn't mine to give you," she said, her voice shaking but firm, "and it certainly isn't yours to take." She hung up the phone. The next day, she met with Alistair. His office felt like the only safe harbor in a raging storm. He had read both claims, his expression grim. "They are trying to crush you between two stones," he said. "The firm is using legal intimidation. The family is using emotional blackmail. They both want the same thing, for you to break." "What do we do?" Elara asked, her voice barely a whisper. Alistair looked at her, his pale blue eyes searching her face. "That depends on you, my dear. What do you want to do? Mr. Thorne's offer is real. You could take it and walk away. No one would blame you." This was her moment of truth. The path of least resistance, the path to safety and wealth, was open to her. But she saw Serafina's face in her mind, a face she only knew from a single faded photograph. but one that was etched into her heart. She saw the strength in that face, the unwavering resolve, and she knew what she had to do. "No," she said, her voice clear and strong, a voice she didn't recognize as her own. "We fight. We find them." Alistair's grim expression softened into a look of profound respect. "Find who?" "The descendants," Elara said. "The people this money belongs to. The watchmaker's son. The girl with the dowry. We use the ledger. We honor the trust. That's the only way to win." Alistair Finch smiled, a true, brilliant smile that seemed to light up the dusty room. "I was hoping you would say that," he said. "Seraphina chose well. Now let's get to work." The decision was made. She was no longer a claimant to a fortune. She was its defender, the custodian, and she would not falter. The realization struck Elara not in a flash of lightning, but as a slow, dawning illumination in the quiet of Alistair's office. She was staring at Seraphina's sewing machine, which she had insisted on bringing to their strategy sessions, finding its presence calming. She ran her hand over the worn, familiar surface, and her fingers brushed against the small, hinged compartment on the side, meant for holding needles and thread. She cleaned it out before, but had paid it little mind. On a whim, she opened it again. Tucked deep inside, almost perfectly camouflaged against the dark wood, was a small, folded piece of oilcloth. Her fingers trembled as she carefully extracted it. It was the user manual for the Singer machine. It was brittle with age, the pages yellowed and smelling of oil. It seemed like nothing. But Alistair, seeing the look on her face, came over. "What is it?" he asked. "I don't know," she whispered, carefully unfolding the fragile paper. As she smoothed it out under the desk lamp, she noticed something faint, something almost invisible between the printed lines of the instructions. The paper had a watermark, but it wasn't the Singer logo. It was a complex pattern, like a weaver's draft. "Alistair," she said, her voice tight with excitement, "do you have a blacklight?" The old lawyer rummaged in a drawer and produced a small, pen-sized UV flashlight. He switched it on, and under its violet glow, the pages of the manual came alive. Written in a fine, elegant hand, in what must have been invisible ink, was Seraphina's true will. It was not a legal document, but a moral one. It was the ledger, not just of names and amounts, but of purpose. Page after page was filled with her clear, steady script, detailing the families, their histories, and her solemn promise to them. And on the final page, a direct message to the future, to the person who had chosen the machine. "To you who holds this," it read, "this fortune is not a prize. It is a burden. It is the collected hope of a people scattered to the winds. Their trust was placed in me, and now I place it in you. Do not let this money become a curse. Use it to mend what was broken. Use it to find our lost threads and weave them back into the fabric of the world. Their legacy is now your legacy. Do not fail them." The words were a gut punch, a direct transmission of will and intent across the decades. This was the final piece of the puzzle. Seraphina's will wasn't just a test, it was a coronation. She wasn't just passing on a key, she was passing on a sacred vow. This discovery changed everything. It transformed their legal position from a defensive crouch to an offensive charge. This wasn't an inheritance dispute anymore. It was a matter of historical justice, a human rights issue. "This is our weapon," Alistair said, his voice filled with a quiet, righteous fury. "We are no longer arguing about who owns the money. We are arguing about what the money is for." Elara felt a profound shift within herself. The fear and doubt that had plagued her began to recede, replaced by a cold, clear certainty. She was not Elara Vance, the timid, overlooked girl. She was the custodian of the shuttle and thread legacy. She was Seraphina's chosen heir, not of wealth, but of duty. The choice was no longer a choice. It was a calling. She looked at Alistair, her eyes blazing with a fire he had never seen before. "My stepfamily's lawsuit," she said. "They claim I cheated them. Let's show the world what they were really cheated out of. Not money, but honor, character." Alistair nodded, a predatory gleam in his eyes. "And the Sovereign Reclamation Group," and he added, "they claim this is stolen state property. Let's show the world the stories of the people they're trying to rob a second time." The moral dilemma had vanished, burned away by the clarity of Seraphina's words. There was no temptation to keep the money, no thought of a settlement. There was only the mission. The path forward was no longer about winning a fortune for herself. It was about fulfilling a promise made by a woman she barely knew, for a people she had never met. It was the hardest path, the one fraught with the most danger, but it was the only one that mattered. She had found her purpose not in the $291 million, but in the invisible ink of an old sewing machine manual. The true inheritance had finally been revealed. The strategy shifted from defense to attack. Alistair, with Elara's newfound resolve fueling his own, decided they would fight this war not in the hushed, confidential corridors of the law, but in the court of public opinion. He knew that a soulless corporation and a greedy family would wilt under the bright, unforgiving light of public scrutiny. Their first move was to contact a journalist. Not just any journalist, but an old-school investigative reporter named Marcus Thorne, no relation to the man from Sovereign Reclamation, who had a reputation for taking on powerful institutions and a soft spot for stories of the underdog. They met in a quiet corner of a university library, a neutral ground. Elara, who once would have been terrified to speak to a stranger, told her story. She didn't lead with the money, she led with Serafina. She spoke of the sewing machine, the journey across the ocean, the community of refugees, the ledger, and the sacred trust. She showed Marcus the manual with its hidden writing, her voice steady and filled with a conviction that was impossible to fake. Marcus listened, his initial skepticism melting away, replaced by the focused intensity of a reporter who knows he has found the story of a lifetime. He was hooked. The first article appeared a week later, not in a flashy tabloid, but on the front page of a respected international news journal. The headline was simple: "The Seamstress's Ledger, a $291 million inheritance and the battle for a lost people's legacy." The story was a bombshell. It framed the narrative exactly as they had hoped, not as a squabble over a windfall, but as a profound moral saga. It painted Elara not as a lucky heiress, but as a reluctant custodian of history. It detailed the claims of the Eastern European Federation, contrasting the government's rhetoric of stolen state assets with the heart-wrenching stories from Serafina's ledger. And it portrayed her stepfamily's lawsuit for what it was: a contemptible, avaricious cash grab. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. The story went viral. Hashtags like #HonorTheLedger and #Serafina's Promise began trending. People were captivated by the image of the old sewing machine against the backdrop of immense hidden wealth. It was a modern fairy tale, but one with a deep moral core. The pressure on their antagonists was immense. Sovereign Reclamation Group, which preferred to operate in the shadows, was suddenly the subject of intense media scrutiny. Their predatory tactics in other cases were dug up and exposed. The government of the Eastern European Federation was forced to issue defensive statements, which were clumsy and only made them look more guilty. But the most immediate and brutal impact was on Isabelle, Brianna, and Chloe. Their lawsuit, which they had filed with such smug certainty, now made them public pariahs. They were portrayed in the media as the greedy, wicked stepfamily from a storybook. Their friends shunned them. Their social circles evaporated. They were deluged with hate mail. The deposition for their lawsuit was a public humiliation. Alistair, with a pack of reporters waiting outside the law office, systematically dismantled their case. He questioned Brianna and Chloe about their relationship with Serafina, forcing them to admit they had never once visited her in her later years. He made them read aloud from Serafina's hidden message in the manual, their voices stumbling over the words of honor and duty, the concepts alien to them. Under the pressure of his relentless, quiet questioning, their composure cracked. Brianna broke down in tears of frustration, while Chloe lashed out in a fit of entitled rage, her outburst captured on an audio recording that was promptly leaked to the press. Elara sat through it all, a silent, composed presence. She felt no triumph, only a profound sadness for them. They were so blinded by greed that they couldn't see the real treasure they had discarded. They had laughed at the sewing machine, and in doing so had laughed away their own chance at redemption, at being part of a legacy far more valuable than money. They were no longer a threat. They were just a cautionary tale. The first front of the war had been won. With the Step family's lawsuit crumbling under the weight of public shame, Elara and Alistair focused their full attention on the real adversary, the Sovereign Reclamation Group and the government it represented. The firm was not so easily dissuaded. They were immune to shame, their only morality being the bottom line. They escalated their tactics, shifting from legal intimidation to a campaign of personal destruction. They hired private investigators to dig into Elara's past, looking for any dirt they could use to discredit her. They found nothing. Her life had been too small, too quiet, too unremarkable. This only frustrated them more. They tried to paint her as a naive puppet, with Alistair as the master manipulator, a washed-up lawyer looking for one last big score. This too failed to stick. Alistair's long and unblemished career spoke for itself. The battle moved into the complex arena of international law. Calla and Stern filed motions in courts in Geneva and New York, seeking to freeze the assets. Alistair, working with a network of international human rights lawyers Marcus Thorne had helped them connect with, filed counter motions. The legal costs were astronomical, but Alistair had arranged for a portion of the funds to be released to cover the expenses, a move the courts approved, seeing it as necessary to ensure a fair fight. The turning point came from Elara herself. While studying the ledger one night, she noticed a recurring geographical name, a small village that was mentioned in the notes for several of the largest depositors. It was the village Serafina had come from. On a hunch, she began a new line of research, not into finance or law, but into genealogy and diaspora communities. Using online forums and social media groups dedicated to the history of that region, she posted a simple anonymous query asking if anyone had relatives who had been watchmakers or jewelers from that village who had emigrated in the 1940s. For weeks, there was nothing. Then an email arrived. It was from an elderly man, a history professor named Andre, living in a small city in a neutral country. His grandfather had been a watchmaker from that very village. His family had a story, passed down through the generations, of how his grandfather had entrusted his life savings to a clever and trustworthy young woman named Serafina before the family was forced to flee. They had lost touch with her and had always assumed the money, and Serafina had been lost to the war. He had documents, old letters, a photograph of his grandfather with a young Serafina. It was the breakthrough they needed. Andre became the human face of the ledger. He was articulate, dignified, and his story was heartbreakingly compelling. He agreed to speak to the media. Marcus Thorne flew to interview him, and the resulting story was even more powerful than the first. Here was a living descendant, a man whose inheritance a corrupt government was trying to steal for a second time. Andre's testimony provided the final, crucial piece of evidence. He was not just a name in a ledger, he was a real person, a link in an unbroken chain of trust that stretched back 80 years. Armed with this, Alistair filed a definitive motion, not just defending their claim, but demanding sanctions against the Eastern European Federation for filing a fraudulent and predatory claim. The international legal community, which had been watching the case with great interest, began to side openly with Elara. The Sovereign Reclamation Group suddenly found itself in an untenable position. Their reputation was being shredded. Their government clients were becoming a liability. Mr. Thorne called Alistair one last time. There was no smooth talk, no veiled threats. His voice was clipped, professional. He informed Alistair that their client was withdrawing its claim, effective immediately. There was no apology, no admission of wrongdoing, just a quiet, bitter retreat. They had lost. Elara heard the news in Alistair's office. She didn't cheer. She didn't cry. She simply closed her eyes and bowed her head, feeling the immense, crushing weight of the battle finally lift from her shoulders. She walked over to the window and looked out at the city below. The legal fight was over. The money was safe. But her work, Serafina's work, was just beginning. The victory was not an end, but a beginning. The legal storms had passed, leaving behind a quiet, altered landscape. The Step family, defeated and humiliated, had retreated from her life entirely, their lawsuit dismissed with prejudice. The Sovereign Reclamation Group had vanished back into the corporate shadows, leaving the $291 million, now slightly diminished by legal fees but still a staggering sum, fully under Elara's control. But the word control felt wrong. She had never felt less in control, and more in service to something larger than herself. The victory in court was not the end of the story, it was the end of the prologue. The real story, the one Serafina had intended for her, was now ready to be written. With Alistair's guidance, she did not claim the money as a personal inheritance. Instead, she petitioned the court to help her establish a legal framework for what she knew she had to do. They formed the Shuttle and Thread Foundation, a charitable trust with a single clear mandate: to find the descendants of the names in Serafina's ledger, and, where descendants could not be found, to use the funds to support displaced people and refugees around the world, in honor of the community that had been lost. Elara was named the Foundation's executive director, a title that felt both absurd and profoundly right. She drew a modest salary, enough to live simply and securely, and moved into a slightly larger apartment, one with a spare room that she could use as a home office. She refused the trappings of wealth, the cars, the mansions, the life her stepsisters had craved. To have indulged in that would have been the ultimate betrayal of Serafina's trust. The Foundation's first official act was to fly Andre and his family to the city. Elara met him at the airport. He was an old man with kind eyes that held the sadness of a long and difficult history. When he saw her, he didn't shake her hand. He embraced her, holding her for a long moment, a silent acknowledgement of the trust that had bound their families together across a century. In Alistair's office, in a quiet ceremony, she presented him with a check. It wasn't just his family's portion of the money, adjusted for 80 years of interest. It was a restoration. It was a piece of his history returned. Andre wept, not for the money, but for the memory of his grandfather, whose faith had finally, after a lifetime, been rewarded. The story of Andre's reunion with his family's legacy became the Foundation's founding story, a powerful symbol of its mission. The work was slow, painstaking, and often heartbreaking. It became her life. She hired a small team of genealogists, historians, and investigators. They were her weavers tasked with finding the lost threads. For every success story like Andre's, there were a dozen dead ends, families who had vanished without a trace, wiped out by war and time. The unclaimed funds, as Serafina had instructed, were put to work. The Shuttle and Thread Foundation began issuing grants to organizations that provided legal aid, housing, and education to modern-day refugees. They funded scholarships for the children of the displaced, helping to create new doctors, artists, and watchmakers. Elara traveled the world, not as a tourist, but as a custodian. She met with families in refugee camps, with community leaders in forgotten slums, with people whose stories mirrored those in Serafina's ledger. She saw her great-grandmother's experience repeated over and over, in different languages and different lands. She was no longer the timid girl from the lawyer's office. She was a figure of quiet strength and moral authority. She spoke with a clarity and purpose that moved people. She had found her voice by speaking for those who had been silenced. The sewing machine Serafina Singer sat in a place of honor in the Foundation's modest office. It was no longer a cracked and forgotten relic. It was a monument, a symbol of the journey, a reminder that the most valuable things are not the ones that glitter, but the ones that endure, the ones that build, the ones that mend. Elara had inherited a fortune, but she had discovered a truth far more valuable: that a legacy is not what you own, it is what you pass on. The money was just the thread. Her life and the lives she touched had become the tapestry. It was a work of immense sadness, of profound responsibility, and of a deep, abiding hope. It was Serafina's final masterpiece, and Elara was the one chosen to complete it.